Now that I'm through talking about all those nasty, dirty words, let's talk about muted group theory. Muted group theory is really nowhere in your book, and there is something that sort of kind of references it, but it's not really there, and I think it's a useful concept for us to discuss. So, to start with, muted group theory comes out of cultural anthropology, just so you know that's actually where it comes out of. You don't have to know that. Charisse Kramer is the one who really takes the time to develop this notion of muted group theory, which hopefully you learned something about back in comm theory. But if not, well, what a wonderful opportunity to learn about it here. So, the focus of muted group theory is on dominant and non-dominant group language use. So, there you are, dominant and non-dominant group language use, and specifically interested in how do dominant groups use language, use certain words. Think about like patriarchal universal discourse. How does a dominant group use language? And how does a non-dominant group have to use the language of the dominant group? And then what are the language practices that the non-dominant group uses that the dominant group usually is not even aware of, or if they are, they have no interest in? Right? And that's very much what this is about. So focusing on dominant and non-dominant groups' language use, recognizing that the language use of the dominant group is used by the dominant group and has to be used by the non-dominant group. And that the language choice, sort of culture and expressions of the non-dominant group often stays within the non-dominant group because the dominant group does not care or notice. So let me give an example of this. If you were to just go back to the examples that I gave in the previous portion of this lecture on the patriarchal universal discourse, and thinking about something like the word balls, or how they use, like grow a pair or big balls, how those expressions are used, it's not uncommon to hear women use that same language in talking about themselves or other women. Right? I told you about a female friend who talked one time about somebody at work challenging her, and she felt like she was dick measuring, or she said, right, getting her penis out, right? And she was saying that hers was bigger. So again, it's that language of, we would say, a dominant group in the sense of dominant in crafting language, and also culturally dominant. Like think about when we talk about politics in the first unit of this class, right? What politics represents. Right? That men have been very dominant in politics and social politics as well as like politics. So women then for their point of view to be, or for their point of view, for their messages to be understood, right? For them to be understood by the dominant group, they have to adopt themselves to the language, the expressions of the dominant group. That's what they have to do. They have to use the language of the dominant group to be recognized. And so there might be some language conventions that are common then among women or among certain groups of women that in the dominant group of which I was born into is less aware and doesn't really have to be aware. So I was thinking about Bossy Pants, which is written by Tina Fey. It's hysterical. It's the only book I've ever read where I laughed out loud the entire time. Someone's had to put the book down as laughing so hard. It's called Bossy Pants. And there's a moment in the book where she talks about an icky feeling, and I can't remember what it was that had happened. And she said that it was icky. She said, it's like touching your eyeball, or your string comes off your tampon. And for the men reading this book, it's like touching your eyeball, and thank you for buying my book. One of the other things that happens is that there are experiences of non-dominant groups that don't ever receive a name or a word that is recognized by the dominant group with some very real implications. So, for instance, it is not a new phenomenon of the last 20, I guess really about 30 years or so, for women, and not just women, but largely women in the workplace, to experience attention often from men that is unwanted and is sexual in nature. It could be touching, it could be joking, it could be request and negotiation of sexual favors, right? Sexual favors in return for advancement. That's nothing that's within the last 30 or 40 years. But a name that's recognized broadly is more recent. Right? So we now recognize it as sexual harassment, as opposed to, previously there's this guy, perhaps a woman says, there's this guy at work, and he keeps coming up behind me, like he puts his arm around me, or sort of gives me a little pat on the bottom. Some might say, well, he's just friendly, or he's just sort of handsy, or well, he's just that way. Now we say, oh, well, he's a sexual harasser, right? So now we have an expression for that. There was the very real problem of women going on dates with men, right? Agreeing to go on a date with a man. In the course of the evening, they had sex against her will, but the police said, I don't understand. So, or she go to report and say, well, can you describe it? Well, I can just tell you who. I don't describe the guy to you. I can tell you who he is. Well, I don't understand. So you know him? Well, we were on a date. You were on a date? I mean, like, and we recognize that, well, this is date rape. That rape is not merely just sort of this woman drug into a dark alley. In fact, the majority of sexual assaults are perpetuated by people who know the victim. Actually, they're most often in the victim's home. It was years before all states recognized that a person could be sexually assaulted within their marriage. It was a long time to recognize that, but the term marital rape helps us to identify forced sex within a marriage as being a form of rape, as opposed to just being forced into marital duties, right? Language that says it was your job or responsibility after all. We call it rape, we recognize it as something different. So you can see how the challenge of non-dominant groups for those with less social influence, as women have historically been positioned in our culture, the challenge then to name experiences and concerns that they have. And also, of course, one of the things we learn is that sometimes the dominant group, when they try to learn or appropriate the language of the non-dominant group, they're not especially good at it. My favorite example being that of Yas Queen. So that's the main idea of muted group theory. There are three assumptions that I want to make sure we take a chance to talk about. So the first assumption is that social divisions lead to the division of language. This is an important concept that goes beyond issues of gender, and in fact, people do muted group theory looking at issues of race and class as well. So social divisions lead to division of language. In many ways, this highlights how communication is fundamental to, well, communities, right? They both have that C-O-M-M, right? And so whenever there is any sort of social, that social division is replicated and reinforced through the division of language, right? So again, whose language is, or whose experiences are represented in language, and whose experiences are ignored in language, or whose use of language is ignored, right? There's the non-dominant group are the ones whose language is ignored. Another assumption of muted group theory, and this is specific to gender, is that men's perceptions are dominant, right? Again, other people have looked at how, for instance, white culture perceptions are dominant. So men's perceptions are dominant. And so that is often how so much of the world is seen and talked about, and the things that are labeled. And again, just look back at all those examples and themes from PUD and the way that how men, or a certain type of man, might see and look at the world is part of the dominant discourse that men and women alike end up using. Right? And that's that last point, right? That women must adopt and become adept. Right? So women have to adopt that language and also get good at using it. Right? And so even if you just think about sports metaphors, which are not necessarily male or masculine, but they've long been associated with masculine culture, because for so often sports culture really only included men. My mom actually talks about after my parents divorced that she had a boyfriend who she was glad finally explained football to her so she could watch it, because my dad never bothered to. He said, I'd just be too complicated. What amounted to was he wanted something just for himself, and so he always found a way to both keep it to himself and sort of hurt my mom's feelings in the process, I suppose, right? But so for women to engage then with men, they may have to adopt the language, whether it's sports or the references to the male body, and become adept, right? Know how to use it and use it well. Right, so this is a principle, again, talked about here in terms of gender, but you can see very easily how it can, in fact, has been used, also discuss issues of race and of class. When we turn to the book has a bunch of terms and concepts, and I'm not really going to lecture on them. I'm going to run through them very quickly, largely because there's a couple of them I know sometimes cause confusion for folks. So I'm going to try to go over them very quickly. And this is that section on how language can be used to oppress and subordinate. So the he-man language, that's where the he is generic and universal, and all very problematic, and I think we've covered that pretty well. There is semantic derogation, which occurs when we have terms that one describing man, one describing woman, and describing the same trait or behavior, and so they should be looked at the same way, but they're not. So if we're talking about a person who we think is having sex with a copious number of people, that man might be called a player and the woman called a slut, but being called a player doesn't really carry the negative connotations like slut does. So the terms are supposedly parallel. That's key there. Supposedly these terms are parallel, describing the same experience or trait, but really we don't understand them to be equal. We understand one of them to be worse, and pretty consistently as the the men or the white men in better position there. Semantic imbalance, this really is a numbers issue. It's about a quantity of terms rather than how we look at it. So if you're trying to differentiate the concept from the book of derogation versus imbalance, imbalance is about the number of terms for a trait or behavior versus derogation is seeing that trait or behavior, the words for it, in a different light. Semantic polarization, this is not about specific words necessarily. It has to do with the idea that we think of words as being associated with male or female. And so a very quick and important example would be hard and soft. We think of hard as being a masculine word and soft as being a feminine word, right, generally speaking. And so when we're talking about, say, the sciences, sometimes people talk about the hard sciences and the soft sciences, or hard skills and soft skills. The hard sciences are the natural sciences. So the hard sciences are the natural sciences. I might have said that too quickly. So chemistry, biology, physics, fields that have largely and long been dominated by men. The soft science, psychology, sociology, communication studies as a social science, right? Largely fields, or more fields have been dominated by women, and they're more about relating to people and people's experiences rather than the natural world. It's seen as soft, it's therefore seen as more feminine. Hard skills are like knowing how to code, right, is a hard skill. Engineering is a hard skill. Learning how to work with people are often called soft skills. We like to call them, in fact, critical skills. Communication skills are critical skills, and having those makes you the most agile and successful in the job market. We actually have data to support that. But again, hard versus soft. Or if you just say pretty versus handsome, where the idea is that the terms are meant to be opposites of each other, or gendered opposites. Marked and unmarked terms, it's pretty clear, female doctor, male nurse, sort of thing. Trivialization, using language to trivialize an individual, as the book says, certainly this and others are not merely about gender, but can also be about race. The book uses the example of boy. Naming, that was pretty clear. It was really focusing a lot on titles, but both the titles that are present and how they're used. A lack of vocabulary. For this, I'd have you reflect back on our discussion we just had, the lecture you just had on muted group. The truncated passive, a little more complicated to describe quickly, but you see the book talks about the way that it takes away women's agency. It really makes women less people and more of an object by using a passive grammatic construction. The falsely universal we, which we see this used very often, you can see used very often in terms of gender, race, class, sexuality, nationality. I mean, this falsely universal we has a tendency to be used in a way that keeps certain people in power and keeps other people on the outside looking in. The deverbing of women, the book talks about this, basically that we have a number of words in which men do things. My favorite, of course, is manning the ship, but women we never think of women as doing things in terms of how we use language about women, right? No one really womans anything. You man something, but you don't woman it. And it just has to do with the way that we've long thought of men as doing things and making a difference, and women as being a part of that scene and not being active in it. And language as violence, which I think the book describes pretty well. If you have questions about this or anything, of course, you should ask in lecture, and I'll see you then.